I give a fuck? Why do I give a fuck? Why do I try so hard? Why do I care so much?
Welcome to Why Do I Give a Fuck? A cross-cultural conversation between myself, Diane Tate,
and Johanna Thompson. In these times of great struggle and possible shift, we ask ourselves,
why do we give a fuck about any of it? How does the lens we see the world through impact what we see?
And what do we do about it?
We're just going to jump right back into it right now, because if we're talking about South Carolina and we're talking about how the South models for the nation, we have to talk about who is going to fill this Lindsey Graham seat, because that's like critically important. And you were telling me that our president, Donald Trump, has made some suggestions on who it is. But let's talk about like who Lindsey Graham is and like the amount of harm that we would hope could be shifted with this opportunity, this crack that you were talking about. You know, windows being cracked and needing to be fixed. What could be like a good fix? Or let's just talk about the person who was there so that we can start to envision what the fix could look like.
Yeah, one of the interesting things for me with Lindsey and the trajectory of his political career is that he was in this Senate seat since 2003. Mm-hmm. He took this seat over after Strom. That was a long time ago. So that's 23 years ago.
Yeah.
And he took the seat from Strom Thurmond. So Strom Thurmond was a senator from South Carolina who, maybe you've heard of him and maybe you haven't. He is one of the well-known white supremacist senators. He used to talk about segregation all the time. He's kind of up there with George Wallace. I mean, a lot of people hear about George Wallace when they hear about powerful U.S. government people who were very vocal about their white supremacy ideologies. Strom Thurmond was right up there. He wanted segregation to always be the rule of the land. And this is the seat that Lindsey took over from. So he wasn't that far from Strom Thurmond. He maybe knew how to navigate more of a modern world, in terms of saying the things that people maybe wanted to hear him say than Strom was. Strom just didn't care. Strom was like, I'm ready to be a white supremacist forever, and I don't care who knows it. Lindsey tried to do that a little differently in the course of his time. He tried to sound like he was more moderate. He tried to sound like, but Lindsey had we were looking at an article that kind of outlined his life and where he came from. And he had some trauma in his childhood. His parents, he wasn't a child. I think he was a young adult, maybe in his 20s when his parents died, but they died within 15 months of each other. And his sister, who's younger than him, was 12 and 13 when the parents died. And so he took over the care of his sister. And
which is fantastic. That's not harm. That's a huge responsibility to take over.
That suggests, care for other humans, humanity,
a little bit of consideration. I'm curious.
A little compassion, maybe.
And he was raised behind a bar. Is that what I understand? And
according to the article that we read, he was raised in a bar / restaurant / pool hall, which was called the Sanitary Cafe, which I don't understand that name.
In South Carolina.
In South Carolina, near Clemson. So upstate area. And
what's that community of people like? I keep interrupting you because I'm curious about it.
No, it's okay. I don't know. It did in the article that we were looking at. I don't know exactly what town he was in, but it was up near Clemson. So that would be upstate of South Carolina. It sounds like it was rural. So, I don't know what the demographics were in terms of predominantly white or not.
You don't know that area. There's not.
But it sounds like, they lived in a room behind the bar. So one room for 2 adults and 2 children would suggest that it was tight quarters, that they were kind of on top of each other. They didn't sound like they had an extravagant existence by any stretch of the imagination. And when his parents they died. And mom was sick and she died from her illness. And then dad had a heart attack like 15 months later. So when that happened, he stepped up. He was the first person, I think the article said, to go to college in his family. He went to the University of South Carolina. He ended up becoming a lawyer. And then one of the first interesting things I read was that after he finished college, he came back and he adopted his sister.
I didn't know you could do that. Actually.
I mean,
Because
it's so
I've worked in
phrasing. He adopted her. He didn't just become her guardian, but he adopted her. And in the article, they said it was because he wanted, if they were ever, because he went into the ROTC when he was in college, and then he ended up going into the Air Force as a JAG, as a lawyer, a JAG officer. He wanted his benefits to go to her if anything happened to him. So he adopted her. But I didn't think
there's also a benefit in adopting rather than being a family caregiver. So I will just also let that know for like my work in dependency care. If you are a family member that cares for somebody, the resources that you get is a lot different than actually being in the system and getting certified to be an adoptive parent and taking on that role. Then you get a lot more support, financial support and everything like that for the state. So that might be an interesting thing if you're coming from lack of resource and trying to identify like what are the ways that you can build some resource for your family for in the struggle. But it's an interesting relationship that is developing with somebody who is biologically your sister. If they are biologically your sister, if she came from the same parents, but we don't know that.
Sounds like she did. I mean, by all,
But we don't know who may be
we don't know.
And babies up in the back of bars up in the north of South Carolina.
We only read this one article. The source is Yahoo News, in case anybody.
It could be anything.
I'll put it in the show notes so that you can go back and read it yourself. But so that was the first interesting thing. I mean, losing your parents, taking care of your sister, still getting yourself into college, all of that sounds like upstanding human, right? But then adopting a sister is interesting, and then
she's his daughter.
She's technically his daughter.
His sister daughter now. All right,
sister daughter.
In something
interesting, little incestuous situation, even if in proximity and title. And then the other thing that I thought was interesting was he did run for president. I'm fast forwarding. He did run for president, I think, for the 2016, I think he ran for president, but I might have that wrong. He was never married. And so I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there were a lot of rumors that Senator Graham was a closeted homosexual human, or at least not a heterosexual human, or didn't identify as heterosexual, because he was never, it says in the article that he thought about asking somebody that he dated when he was in the Air Force to marry him, but then it never manifested. And so it was kind of a running joke. And I remember when he ran for president, there was a lot of speculation because, and Tim Scott went through this too, when he was running for president, he didn't have a woman in his life either. And he had, Cory Booker just got married, and, there's a lot of speculation about whether or not that's a real marriage, because we know that he's got aspirations for running for president. And in the US, it tends to be this narrative that you can't, have to be this wholesome, upstanding, historically male, married with children, or at least the potential for children on the way, that we've never had.
This kind of 1950 ideology of what the American family should be, is what the standard and the narrative of who should be holding political office. So if you don't fit that, even if you're a male, a white male person, if you don't fit all of those narratives, then your run for office is a lot more difficult because of the social construct the way that we think about in the United States.
We don't have a problem with single people being in the Senate or in the House, but if you're going to run for president, you better get that wife, and you better have that life.
This nuclear family of Christian, upstanding husband, wife, kids situation.
And it is always Christian. Yes, absolutely. That is the other piece of that narrative. So the fact that Lindsey wasn't married and had never really been seen with a woman on his arm in any kind of space, and the speculation about his identity, sexually speaking, was a big, there was a lot of rumor mills were flying about that. And it was interesting. You and I were reading this article, and he actually spoke to it leading up to his running for president. He said that that his sister and his, actually, let me get it in front of me so that I can say it the way it was put in the article, because I thought it was just so interesting the way it was talked about.
They were talking about this.
Let's see, what did it say? Well, you talk while I'm looking for it, because I want to make sure that I'm.
Well, I was just thinking about, like, on the other side of all of the, like, social commentary about his personal life, what we see on his political life is that he is very, very, very supportive of interjecting American values in other countries, you know, American US values, I should say, in other countries, with his appropriations and support of wars and support of violence and harm against other people. So we're seeing that there is this personal struggle, and we're also seeing this, like, political profile that is very violent and harm against people, as he's experiencing all of this violence and harm, I'm imagining, with the speculation of how his life is existing.
Yeah. And it's always frustrating to me to see someone who has either experienced before or is currently experiencing judgment and harm based on their personal private life to then turn around and inflict such incredible
Use that
harm.
power.
Again, yeah, it just, I mean, he was a huge proponent. There was a lot of stink over the course of his time in office in the Senate, where he would support these homophobic laws. He was very against trans rights, you know, and it was just like, dude, you know, if you don't feel like, for whatever reason, you can, you know, claim your identity and be who you are out in the open, the least you can do is not support these laws that then further suppress and create,
unless he's trying to, like, make
the
a point,
exact same situation of why you can't be who you want to be. You know, it's like,
but he could be trying to make the point of supporting these laws to reject. You know what I mean? Like, to prove the point. I'm rejecting all of this speculation about what my life is. So it's a really interesting dichotomy that should not be how we are doing our politics.
Yeah.
But it just reminds us that humans go into these positions of and hold these positions of power and have a great impact on our lives because of how they're experiencing their personal life. But go ahead, you're about to read this piece of the article.
Yeah, I found it.
Right.
It's in this Yahoo News article about Lindsey, and kind of an overview. I'll put the link to it in the show notes, but this particular paragraph was really interesting. His bachelorhood became a running punchline during his short-lived 2016 presidential campaign. So it was 2016. And Graham was usually the one telling the joke. Asked who would serve as first lady in a Graham White House, he said he would have a, I'm using air quotes, rotating first lady, suggesting his sister and friends could play that role if necessary, according to ABC News. So,
which is the suggestion that Donald Trump is making to the governor of South Carolina right now, is to appoint his sister into that position. I don't know what her qualifications are for it, but that would be a really interesting way of looking at our political climate, where in order to honor somebody, the person who is being thought of to fill a position that has held a tremendous amount of power for a long period of time is somebody who is someone's sister, wife, daughter. I don't really know. But the way that relationship that Lindsey Graham had with his younger sister.
Yeah. I mean, and it's not the first time. I think when, you know, Representative Clyburn, who we also mentioned is in the House in South Carolina, he's been in office for 30 plus years. Hello, doggy. And he has talked about retiring and has talked about stepping down from his seat. And the conversation is always that his daughter will take over. So this is not the first instance of somebody deciding that they're going to step away from a seat and that they're going to basically appoint and elevate a member of their family to take that seat after they leave. Whether or not that person has any qualifications is just, it's a manifestation of dynasty and the way things tend to work in the US when it comes to relatives and friends and people of proximity taking over a seat of power that they're not qualified for, you know? I mean, and even if they are qualified, you know, And I know that Clyburn's daughter would have done this. She would have run for office. She would have put her hat in the ring for it. And then, hopefully the electorate would decide whether or not she was qualified. But there's this sense of appointment. There's a sense of elevation and ascension to these spaces that have absolutely nothing to do with whether or not somebody's qualified for something. So,
right, which is it's a consideration that we have as to like what the foundations of our laws and our legislation, how they really are demonstrative of what the people in the communities need.
Yeah.
Right. They're not demonstrative of what the people in the communities need, to the point of the person who is running against whoever becomes the candidate on the Republican Party needing to make sure that you're reaching out to the constituents in your communities and really figuring out what the needs are. And I am curious to hear what the people in South Carolina wants, like as far as it goes with legislation and all of those things.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been there, lived there for 5 years, almost 6 years, but I do remember when I was there that it oftentimes just became this dichotomy. And you spoke to this actually when we were in Charleston for our episodes that we did there. There's this dichotomy of wanting change and yet wanting change only within the boundaries of the status quo, which is not change. So it's bizarre to me how, and I'm sure there are other states that operate like this, and maybe most of them are in the South. I don't know. I mean, they're the same could be said really for Democratic states, that tend to lean Democratic on the regular. It's had a history of being democratically led. You wonder sometimes is that because that's really what the electorate wants, or is because it's familiar and it's status quo and it makes people feel comfortable. It doesn't necessarily speak to whether or not the people that are in those positions of power are actually what the constituents want, or actually running or have ideologies that are in alignment with. So anyway, yeah, it's I think it could happen on both sides. I think we tend to think of it only in the red states, and we tend to think of it in the places like Kentucky, for example, who, is now facing the possibility of Mitch McConnell. Like, he wasn't running for re-election. There's a lot of rumor that he's already gone, and what will happen with that seat. But Kentucky is one of the poorest states in our nation, and McConnell was in his office for decades, and his people continue to suffer. They continue to be at the bottom of the list. And South Carolina is similar. Mississippi is similar. And it's like, how do these people stay in these positions? I remember growing up in North Carolina, Jesse Helms was in the Senate in North Carolina. And the entire time I was growing up, Jesse Helms was in the Senate. And I didn't know that wasn't the norm, because in my head, he was the person that was supposed to be there. And he was a Strom Thurmond-esque kind of guy. He was segregation now, segregation forever. He was such a white supremacist. And yet he kept getting reelected. I never knew that seat could be anybody different than Jesse Helms, because my entire growing up, he was in that seat. So,
and the same thing is happening in Florida right now, right? Because the incumbent, Ron DeSantis, can no longer serve as the governor of Florida. And so now we had this open seat available, was specifically for the Democratic Party. We have, Byron, who is the Republican candidate in Florida. And then there was like this open seat with David Jolly and as a Democrat, but he used to be a Republican, and then he was independent for a long time, and then declared as we were going into the primary about 14 months before that he would be a Democrat, which is a curiosity to me, because we do know that the Project 2025 has a policy of planting folks who really hold Republican ideology into the Democratic Party. So for me in Florida, I'm like, that's a big alert with David Jolly. And when Demings dropped out because he's dealing with family issues, there's there's multiple other people who are either non-party affiliates or Democrats that are also running for our primary to determine who we're going to be able to vote for as our governor when it comes to the actual elections in November. Yeah. And in Florida, it's a closed primary, meaning that if you're not registered as a Republican or a Democrat, you cannot vote in the primary. So that all of the people who are non-party affiliates or anybody who has decided that they don't want to choose a political party, they are not going to be participating in our primary election, which is a tremendous amount to our point of voter disenfranchisement. There's a tremendous amount of people that are not going to have their say in at least electing a governor unless they choose a party, which is a lot of people we're seeing. It's not the trend that's happening in Florida. But again, we have these cracked windows and these opportunities for us to shift what our political climate looks like on a local level, which then would translate to how we're seeing our policies administered on a national level and then on an international level. If we don't have people like who have this ideological ideas about how they want to administrate U.S. foreign policy or U.S. policy here in the territory.
Yeah, it all feels incredibly hopeless right now for a lot of people in the U.S. And I'm not suggesting that is not unfounded, right? It does feel like this cascade of situations happening that are pushing the country even further away from what we would like to see it happen. But one of the things that I take heart with and that excites me about living in this world today is that we are learning as well that loud use of internet and social media and keeping our voices heard, staying in the streets, doing what we need to do to remind our elected officials that they work for us the pressure does work. It doesn't work as quickly as we might like it to work. And there are a lot of, 2 steps forward and 10 steps back. But if we keep the pressure on, as we talked about in the last episode, that crack can split the whole windshield if we just apply enough pressure. We have to keep that pressure up. We have to stay engaged. We have to keep calling our representatives and our senators. We have to keep letting people know that we're not okay with the choices that they're making. And the more pressure that we continue to put on, the harder it's going to be for them to just ignore us and keep doing what they're doing. So, it can be very disheartening to try to manage that and try to figure out how to keep going, because it's exhausting. That's part of the reason why they keep that we all want to just go to sleep and say there's nothing we can do. So I'm done, because that's what they want. They want us to stop trying. They want us to stop feeling like we have any kind of power in the situation. That works for them. That works in their favor.
Absolutely. No, yeah. If we're talking about like holding power, then I'm hearing us sharing our voices to kind of push back on what we know is already existing.
Right.
Again, I'm struggling with the way that political power and legislative power is being used in this moment. So the way that I'm seeing our demonstrations against it is kind of letting more of the national and the international sphere know that all of these things are happening politically and legislatively, but the actual people of the United States are not in agreement with what is happening politically and legislatively. Right. So, because yes, we're showing up, but then they're also changing the laws. They're also changing the way that people power is able to be utilized. And so that is where we have to be very spending a lot of time paying attention to that and identifying the ways that we can have our needs met within the kind of political structure. Because if more people cannot buy their food, or if more people cannot pay their home insurance, or if more people are not living on, a wage that allows them to be able to do that, or if more people don't have access to their health care, there's going to be a reaction that we can't function as nation that people expect the United States to be.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, because foundationally, we're not, the gaps and economies of scale are growing so greatly that you're going to have too many people that do not have their resources. And what we have is our political climate, as our legislative policies are going to have to shift, because you're not going to be able to sustain the amount of people that need resources. And that's going to be a major critical thing, especially as we're talking about the way that they are politicizing who is a citizen and not a citizen in the United States.
Right. Yeah, none of this is going to be a quick fix. Mm-hmm. And I think we live in a society now, especially with the internet, where we want instant gratification. We want things to happen quickly. And it's not going to happen quickly, because the people that are in power, it takes a lot to get them out of that power, to get them out of the ability to do the harm that they're doing, which we circle back around to our original topic, which was the death of Lindsey Graham, and how multi-layered that particular event is. That it's not just the death of a man, it is the death of a person who used his power to harm others. It is also the opening of a very powerful position in our current government at a time where, like you said, they are changing the laws. They are making it difficult for people to be able to recourse. We talked, I think, in the last episode where we're talking about they're trying really hard to go away from one person, one vote and go back to one household, one vote. So there are very real evils that are happening, and there is power within the hands of the electorate, albeit diminished, albeit disenfranchised, albeit changing on the daily. And there is reason for us to stay in the game. So all of those things are true at the same time. And I want to say to what your point was about how there are not as many resources to help people in communities, because we saw that when Trump first came back into office for the second time, how he started dismantling all of these agencies, and how those agencies, right now, as we're taping this, the country is experiencing, the U.S. is experiencing an outbreak of cyclospora, which is a bacteria infection that comes from unwashed food. And Taco Bell.
I didn't even notice. Yeah. I didn't turn on the news. I don't be turning on the news in the morning.
I know you don't. I know.
All
and I get it. I get
going on.
I'm your news connection. But cyclospora it's a bacteria that causes extreme diarrhea and vomiting and stomach cramping for weeks on end. People can die from it because it severely dehydrates you, and it your body ends up shutting down. And the CDC has they had certain. The Center for Disease Control, for people that might be out of the U.S., is an agency that monitors diseases and monitors things that can cause diseases and disease outbreaks. And so RFK Jr. is the head of the. He's not the head of the CDC. He's the head of the Homeland, the Health and Human Services agency, but he oversees the CDC, and he has cut. There were programs in place that tracked the movement of certain diseases, and he has cut that so much. Cyclospora is one of those diseases that the CDC no longer tracks. So we have all of these people that are getting sick from unwashed leafy vegetables, and Taco Bell, it was one of the few restaurants that I've heard about that's had this major outbreak. And so because the CDC is not tracking the advent of that disease anymore, we don't know how many people have it. We don't know how fast it's traveling. We don't know where the hotspots are. We're flying blind on how our typical systems that were in place to try to mitigate an outbreak of something like this aren't working, because the agency that was supposed to be tracking it is no longer tracking it. So this is a perfect example of systems that are breaking down. And what I wanted to say to that, or the reason I brought all that up, is because what I'm learning is that mutual aid, that communities setting up new systems that are not dependent on government anymore, is
the direction.
Is where we have to go. So I didn't want to end this episode without speaking into that, because I'm learning about that more that it's not about charity, it's about mutual aid. It's about communities coming together and meeting a need that the members of their community have that is not reliant upon governmental systems that can decide one day, well, we're not going to do that anymore, or we don't think the people that's serving it are worthy of our efforts anymore. And so that's going to go away. As a community, as a society, we can create new systems that are not dependent on the government. And that's where I'm hearing so much of the organizing happening now, that it's not about saving the systems that we had in place. It's about creating new ones that can't be impacted by white supremacist power holders in the U.S.
Well, that's what it is. We want to shift the existing structures and also define the things that we need in community, to your point. Like, what does public health look like? Does it look like we are focusing on identifying where we have the greatest impacts of harm and violence in our communities, a cyclospora, an outbreak, death and killing from, specific agencies? Those things are how we as community can define which is our public health issues, and then we can identify what the resources are and hopefully create methodologies that support that through mutual aid, but then also challenge our political systems to resource those things for us.
Yeah. Yes. Well, the hope, I think the hope is that the mutual aid that we develop, the systems, the new systems that we develop, will be community based in such a way that if the government wants to help, wants to supplement, wants to whatever, more power to them. But the community has got this. And so we're not dependent on the government being run by people. Yeah, we're not dependent, because we clearly are struggling with getting people out of power that are so power hungry and driven by white supremacy and driven by bigotry and driven by this need for greed. We're having a hard enough, that's a slower process to get those people out of office and to get new people in office that actually share our ideologies of humanity and compassion and making sure people can eat and have access to healthcare and access to housing. That is going to take a lot longer because our systems are so entrenched. And so instead of taking it's a both and. I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both and. We can't lose sight of how we might be able to shift our political structures. And in the meantime, let's build these other systems and resources. So it's both and.
And then also within you're doing that, checking in on where you fall in the spectrum of white supremacy and your understanding of it, especially if you are doing a mutual aid. Because if you're doing a mutual aid operating in white supremacy as you're doing the mutual aid, then you're going to see the same type of impacts in the structures that are developed. And we want to that's the thing, those are the things that we actually want to shift. We want people to be sitting in their reflection of how they impact others, so that as we are developing mutual aid and coming up with the resources that meet the needs of our communities, we can actually have effectual change.
Amen.
Let's
do that.
Let the good times roll.
Sounds like a plan to me.
But I do want to talk about public health as we go into our next conversation, because I think that's really important in this moment, and she brought it up.
Yeah, sounds like a plan. All right, stay tuned.
Let's do it. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, as you move throughout your day, continue to ask yourself,
Why Do I Give a Fuck is produced in collaboration with Johanna and Diane. Music by Norwegian musician Water. See you next time.